Okay. Good morning. Today we will continue with sociolinguistics. We'll be finishing up some concepts, the content of chapter 4, and we'll see how far we get. Then next time it's going to be chapter 5. Before we talk about the concepts in chapter 4 in more detail, I wanted to just give you a little bit of a review of the language variation stuff that we have already covered. Sometimes people refer to sociolinguistics as the study of language variation, and that certainly makes sense. It is the study of language and society, as you have learned. So language variation, as we have, so this is a review. Language variation covers these specific facts. People speak different languages. We here speak English. In other places, that default language would be Spanish or Russian or whatever. People speak different dialects of their languages, and that's true of all of us. In a default situation, we would be defaulting to that native dialect, and everyone speaks a bit differently depending on the situation. And that would be do you remember what kind of variation that is? What term do we use for that? Would be register variation, exactly. So, so while everyone speaks a language and a dialect of a language, we all change the way we speak depending on the situation, and we'll look at these in these slides. We'll look at those situations in more detail. So language variation covers the fact that there are languages, there are dialects, there are registers, and there are idiolects. What are idiolects? Quick review. Individual ways of speaking that we can recognize a person. Oh, that was my mom who called, or that was my sister who called, because they sound a little bit different in their language. Accent, we mentioned accent, that it's a feature of dialects. It's the phonological features of a dialect, and everyone speaks with an accent. So while everyone speaks in a dialect, even those who say we speak only standard English, that standard English is a dialect, and everyone speaks in an accent, not just us foreigners. So it's a feature of dialects, and everyone has a dialect, therefore everyone also has an accent. Slang refers to stylistic choices, very often vocabulary choices. Slang terms, they come and go. We can, identify or date a person if they use something like spiffy or slang terms for like cool. Cool has stayed a long time. I think people still use that. But what do you say when you refer to something that is extraordinarily good?
Like awesome.
What is that?
Awesome.
Awesome. Yes. Awesome is commonly used, and of course, awesome was initially, it meant fear-inducing, but then we get some new terms, like the term epic has not been around for a long time for something that is good or cool. So people may be dating themselves if they use a particular term, because that term was born and became somewhat prevalent in a particular decade, but then it did not stick in the language. In the 1980s, when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were invented, so they used the term radical, which was a nice blend between radical and cool, so radical. Yep. So slang terms, they're kind of like, it's interesting because if they become prevalent, then they stay in the language and they make their way even into dictionaries. But it's not a given in the beginning because the term needs to become somewhat frequently and widely used before it has the chance of sticking in the language. So those are stylistic choices, and lexicon is the clearest indication that someone speaks in a slang. And you can use those slang terms in, again, depending on the situation of language use. Now, jargon is referred to. It also has to do with vocabulary more so than with the grammar of the language. It is related to a profession, like for instance computerese or legalese. Those would be jargons, and you know, every new discipline that you learn, there is an insider jargon that people like to use in order to, again, we make these choices because we want to send certain messages. And you send a message if you are a lawyer and use legalese, a register that has a lot of legal terms. That means that you want to send the message that you're an expert in this area. Medicalese would be what doctors use. We call it doctorese. I don't know if I'm making this term right now. If I am, we'll see if it spreads. But doctorese. But you see how that kind of marks a person as an expert. Sometimes it's kind of, you know, right now that we have had to kind of step into this new brave new world that uses a lot of technology. I have noticed that I try to read instructions of how to do something with a particular program, for instance. Well, say for instance Blackboard, how to use a particular feature on Blackboard, and I, you know, Google and I how to do this thing on Blackboard, and you get these little videos which are very helpful often. But I also notice that, especially if it's a written instruction, sometimes people enter their answers to blogs and so on. That would be like outside Blackboard, but you can ask a question about Blackboard and you're taken to this blog, and some people clearly on that blog, they are kind of like just showing that I am an expert in computers, in technology, and so on, and I'm using this jargon. And then it's not very helpful if you are not an insider into that particular jargon. I've learned a lot of that, so, you know, just keep using the jargon and teach me more. But sometimes it means that it takes a little bit longer to kind of get your answers. Do you have any comments about the use of jargon by anyone?
Like you work retail, then there's probably some jargon that goes around your store, your certain store.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What about you?
Well, my brother's been staying with us recently, and he works at Deloitte in accounting.
Yeah.
When he talks about work, it's like a lot of like, oh, risk management, data input, Excel.
Exactly, right, yes. So people are marking themselves. I'm an expert here. I'm using these words to mark my own expertise, like risk management. Yeah, very good. Yes, great. So those were just some terms that we have been reading about. So we talked quite extensively about language versus dialect and how mutual intelligibility often defines language boundaries, but not always, because different spoken dialects of Chinese, we use that as an example, Mandarin and Cantonese, they are not mutually intelligible, but Mandarin is not called a language as opposed to Cantonese as another language, so they're just Chinese dialects. That's because people ultimately, the speakers of a language, a variety, a dialect, they decide whether they want to group their varieties as separate languages or just dialects of the same language. So different language may also be mutually intelligible, and we took the example from Scandinavia, like Swedish and Norwegian, mutually understandable, clearly different dialects at least, but people have decided to call them different languages, and that separation goes along the state boundary. So people have decided to do that. Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian in the former Yugoslavia now are called languages, even though Serbian and Croatian, for instance, they were formerly, when the Yugoslavia was still together and under the Iron Curtain at that time, that was before the leader Tito died. And when he died, then these different groups, ethnic groups who spoke different languages as their identity marker, they decided that Croatian and Serbian are going to be called different languages, even though linguistically they would not necessarily at that point have been defined as different languages because they are mutually understandable, but people did not want to, people used it for, I would say, nationalistic purposes to enforce, strengthen their ethnic identity, and then what happened was, of course, the war on the Balkans, the very bloody civil confrontations, and so Croatians were killing Serbs and Serbs were killing Croatians, and just to simplify a very complex situation. And then why would we want to be speaking the same language as our enemy? This was in the early 90s and 1990s. And the language that had been the same language, Serbo-Croatian with a hyphen, then split into two different languages. And what people started to do was consciously start to emphasize the dialectal differences between those two varieties in order to mark themselves as speakers of a different variety, which they wanted to call a different language. So that has been an interesting case study. Now the hostilities are over. There is a state called Serbia, a state called Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and people achieved these goals in a way through that very tumultuous situation, violent, and language was part of that. And now these different states have their specific languages. But the point is that Croatian and Serbian were called just dialects of the same language, Serbo-Croatian. They split. So people ultimately decide what happens in society if there is civil unrest, if there's a war, if there's hostility by one group of speakers against another one, then it very often happens that you don't want to be speaking the same language. And that also has to do, with the selection of languages that are taught in schools. They have a long history. That may change when the world changes, but the selection of what to teach in school, and we'll talk more about this once we get to the language policy chapters. That's based on cultural bonds between countries, and what languages are regarded as useful languages for children to learn. And that, of course, it varies from time to time. It varies from place to place and time to time. And time changes have to do with changes in attitudes. Last time we talked about attitudes and what to select to teach at school is a consequence of attitudes toward language. So typically in an American high school, what foreign languages can you learn there? Spanish. What else? That's it. That's it. I think they sometimes offer German and French also, but you would have to go to a different kind of a place within the United States if you can study, for instance, Chinese, or you would have to go to a private school which kind of specializes in those things. Earlier, we go back like half a century, and I still occasionally get a student who has taken Latin in high school. But have you ever heard of Latin being offered nowadays? Yeah, so it has become, it has to be some kind of a special school if you study Latin, and that is an indication of a change. Latin was this lingua franca of the common language of the academe in the Middle Ages, and that effect it lasted actually for centuries, so that school children, in order to be educated, they had to be educated also to know some Latin. And then people just kind of like sat down and decided that, well, Latin is a dead language, so why not offer a relative to Latin, which is Spanish or French or Italian, but it really is kind of, nothing happens in a vacuum when these decisions are made. And anyway, so let's see. Dialect versus register, and register is pretty much the same as style. Style has, yes?
If these languages, the different languages, are mutually intelligible, would they be considered dialects of each other?
Which ones?
The ones that are mutually intelligible as languages?
Mutually, if they are mutually intelligible, then they are usually called dialects of the same language. Does that?
So like, even though they're different languages, they can be dialects of each other?
Dialects of, yeah, so if we have the cover term dialect language up here, it's like the umbrella term, and every language has several dialects. And those dialects are dialects of that one language. But these dialects may, over the history, they may split and start developing into separate languages. And probably the most, did I answer your question?
Yes.
So that's a really good question. The most common situation of a language splitting into, and relatively recent in human history, is the language Latin, and it was vulgar Latin, which just means that it wasn't like vulgar, how we understand the word vulgar, but vulgar Latin in terms of it being the language that normal people actually spoke, not the classical Latin which we find only in classical literature. So this is a spoken Latin. And what happened when people started moving into different places, or continued moving into different places, so you got different Latin split into different languages, which were initially mutually understandable because they were all dialects of Latin. So here we have the language, which is the cover term, and then dialects here. And these dialects, just some examples. So we have Spanish, which was initially just a regional dialect of Latin, but it evolved into a language of its own. It acquired the status of a language. French, Italian, Portuguese, then several others, Galician, Romanian. So these were spoken in, and so on and so forth. This is just like, you know, a few examples. But these all were dialects of Spanish, dialects of Latin, and then when people got separated from each other, the languages continued to develop in certain ways. Certain phonological developments happened in different languages, and they became more and more different when people were not constantly in contact with each other. And they were also like, okay, this is going to be the variety of Latin spoken, for instance, in what is today Spain, what is today France, what is today's Italy, and so on, Portugal, Romania, and Galicia, and all the other places. So the other first dialects of Latin, now in individual, independent languages. And that's an interesting situation, because it often happens if there's some kind of a boundary between people. It can be a state boundary, it can be a huge mountain range, it can be a big river that separates speakers of one dialect from the speakers of the other dialect. It can be a very thick forest, like in Europe, the Black Forests, the Schwarzwald was just really, really thick and almost impenetrable. So if you were on this side of the forest or this side of the forest, you didn't communicate with each other. And obviously, you know, in the communication devices that we have today, they hadn't been invented, so there was now we can cross. I pick up my phone and go on FaceTime, and I can communicate with my daughter in England across, you know, a huge big ocean, which in the olden times would have been a big boundary. And before ocean steamers, you couldn't even send really mail regularly, letters, and so on. But now this has become possible, so boundaries can be crossed with the modern communication devices. But that's going to be kind of, you know, interesting in seeing whether that will slow down the split of a variety of language into into a variety of language that is a dialect, into completely separate languages. See, that could have happened. This kind of a split could have happened with English. English being a language, and then English in the colonies. So today we have British English, which is a dialect in the same place as where American English is a dialect of English. But this could have, and there are other, you know, Canadian English, African Englishes, Indian Englishes, everywhere where the Brits went during the times of, you know, colonialism. There developed different dialects of English. English was introduced by the ruling class, and then people adopted that version, but because it was in contact with the local languages, it got its own features, and people would be speaking that with their native dialects being reflected in that particular variety of English, the dialect. So we could have had a situation where English, the language, could have split into two different languages. The English that the Brits speak, which would have been a different language from what the Americans speak, but that happened at the time in the history of humankind. You know, if you think of when the pilgrims came to America, then the communication via mail was also possible. There was this back and forth. That sometimes there was, a war even, the American War of Independence. But that actually also brought people together, even though in a very hostile situation. But that was the time when if there was an invention, I think I mentioned this earlier, that when the railroad was invented, the trains were invented. They were invented separately in Britain and in America, and the train terminology is slightly different. Well, here we talk about railroad, and in Britain they talk about railway. Not a big difference, but still a difference, a dialect difference. But if this kind of separation had been deeper, then we might have seen it is a logical possibility that British English would have developed into a different language from American English, and eventually of course related, but maybe even mutually unintelligible. It didn't happen, because nowadays we can talk with each other, just go on FaceTime, and you can contact your friends in England, and they can contact you over whatever WhatsApp or whatever you use, whatever application you use, and we can send emails, and so instant communication across an ocean, and that is likely to keep British English and American English just as dialects of English, and never becoming, we should never say never, but not likely to develop into different languages, like what happened when Latin started splitting into the other Italic or Romance languages. Okay. So all people speak in a dialect. We've said that before, and what I cannot emphasize enough is that with our dialect we send a message of our group affiliation to other people, to the people we communicate with. But we also alter the way we speak depending on the situation. So we have dialect variation, register variation. Register or style variation, it's the variation according to the situations of language use. So this is kind of like a recap of what we mentioned before. And dialect variation is the variation according to groups of language users. And we have regional or geographic variation. We have socioeconomic variation, high, middle, working class, lower class speakers. Linguists have adopted these classification terms from sociology, not because we want to classify people into different castes, but we want to use the classification for a purpose, and the purpose is to explain language variation. And language variation is something that linguists don't take as a judgment call, but it also explains why some peoples, that is the middle class or higher class dialects, they have acquired this prestige, this overt prestige, like standard dialects, not only in English but in other languages as well. There's gender variation. Women and men, they tend to speak a little bit differently, and people can signal their gender identification by the way they speak. So, a little girl who is tomboyish can consciously, subconsciously or consciously speak like a little boy, and that way assert her own gender identity, that I'm not a girly girl. I don't like to wear pink in the same way I don't like to talk like a girl. Do you see what I mean? And of course, this applies to adults as well. We can use language to send a message of our identity. Age variation: a 70-year-old person speaks slightly differently from a 17-year-old person, obviously speaking in a mutually intelligible way, but a different dialect, and that would be a gender dialect, age dialect. Ethnic variation: your ethnicity does not predict how you speak. In the same way as our DNA is not, our language is not part of our DNA. We acquire language from the people we associate with, and ethnic variation the same way. It doesn't mean that whatever your ethnicity is, you don't necessarily speak like the stereotype of that particular ethnicity, but you can. And if you do, then you message to other people, I belong to this group of speakers and I am proud of it. This is subconscious most of the time, but sometimes it becomes kind of conscious, right? So socioeconomic variation is often mistaken for ethnic variation, because if we just think of different ethnicities, sometimes a person speaks in a particular non-standard dialect, not because that person is of a certain ethnicity, but because a person may be coming from the working class and doesn't have the academic education that typically is associated with the standard varieties. Does that make sense? Do you have any comments on that? Those are very interesting. When we think about the language variation, we can you can start thinking about what you want to do your presentations on. So there's rich amounts of possibilities. Your book has this is one of the non-standard varieties, a prevalent non-standard variety of English, and your book has a good subsection on African American vernacular. It is an ethnic dialect, and the question is, and we kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, we brought up the question, why is it that no matter where an African American lives, if they live in a big city, for instance, from Detroit to Boston to New York to Los Angeles to Houston to Dallas, their varieties of language may share certain features, and typically do. Again, I want to emphasize that we are not looking at highly educated African Americans who tend to be conversing more in the standard variety of English, but they very often are able to switch back and forth, do the code switching or multilingual discourse. So why do these varieties share features, and what is the origin of these features? And there's been a lot of research, a lot of proposals of why where African American vernacular English came from, and this is the dialect of American English that has been studied a lot. There are a lot of studies. There's a lot of research done on this particular variety. So there are several hypotheses, and most of them are probably partially correct. So all of these hypotheses kind of like contribute to the explanation, but people have been fiercely disagreeing with each other about the origins of African American vernacular. there is this Afrocentric view, which is based on the idea that some features may go back all the way to the Niger-Congo languages. So people, when they were brought into the United States, they brought, of course, the language varieties with them. And these would have been the Niger-Congo languages, African languages. What was done often on the slave ships was that people were separated from the other speakers of their language in order to prevent mutinies. I don't know if you've heard of Amistad. It's a movie which is about a mutiny on a slave ship. They didn't often happen because people were unable to communicate with each other effectively because they were speakers. Africa is a very rich country in terms of linguistic variation. There are a lot of different languages, hundreds and hundreds of different languages. Anyway, the Afrocentric view, it claims that some features may go back all the way to Africa, to African languages. That makes sense, right? Because the same thing is Louisiana Creole, for instance. The English spoken in Louisiana often by Creole people. It has features, some phonological features that go all the way back to French, right? In the same way, in the upper Midwest, you find the Scandinavian regions with a lot of Scandinavian immigrants there, and their language has some traits, their dialect has some traits from Scandinavian language. You may have the little bit of a sing-songy tone by the original Swedish or whatever, and Minnesota is sounds a little bit like how a Swede would say that. So it's totally understandable that and acceptable that this might be one reason for the characteristics of this particular variety. Then there's the Eurocentric view, which is sometimes also referred to as dialectologist view. So some features in African American English may go back to Irish or Scotch Irish or English dialects. That is the dialects of the field supervisors from whom African slaves then learned English. Makes sense, huh? In the same way, it makes sense as the Afrocentric view, the Eurocentric or dialectologist view. Now, the field hands, the supervisors, they were not educated people. They didn't have university education. They didn't have education often at all, very minimal education. And this means that they were speaking in working class, laboring class dialects of their own region. So again, you have the mixture of original region from England and the class, social class issue. So picking up English from the field workers meant that they were not that the slaves were not picking up English that would have been academic English, right? So it's one of the explanations, competing explanations. The creolist view is this: the slaves, they had to learn English and they had to communicate. And this is our next chapter, chapter 5, introduces us to Pidgins and creoles, contact languages. And this is what happened in those situations when you have brought a person, a human being, across the ocean to this country where they are then working as forced labor, and they had to communicate with people, other people. They had to communicate with each other who came from whose native languages were different African languages, and they had to communicate with the field hands, and they had to communicate sometimes with their owners, and so on and so forth. So what do you do in a situation where you are kind of like airdropped in a place where you don't know the language? And you have to communicate, so you start picking up words, but it's easier to pick up words like nouns and verbs and even adjectives and adverbs, content words, but it's difficult to pick up the grammar of the language without a grammar book. And even if you even if at the port of arrival everybody had been given, hey, here's an English grammar book, of course the slaves could not read, and it was even illegal to teach a slave to read. So it was a horrible situation. But yet you have to communicate. So what you resort to is a simplified way of communication. So you drop out a lot of the grammar, and this would be called a pidgin. And this happens in every situation. If you, for instance, have to go to a place in the world where you don't know the language of, if you've never studied Japan, and there are places in Japan where we have this idea that everybody speaks English everywhere, especially in Japan, but no, not necessarily. If you have to be in like a rural place in Japan and you don't know any Japanese, you've never studied any Japanese, what you have to start doing is picking up words that are kind of like essential for communication, and you pick up those words, but you don't necessarily pick up the grammar. And so that would be called a pidgin. The word pidgin is said to come from the Chinese way of saying, a Chinese pidgin, which is one of these contact languages, and in Chinese pidgin English, the word business would have been pronounced something like pidgin. So that's hypothesized. We don't really know what the etymology of it is, but that's one plausible hypothesis. So anyway, this variety started to develop, and it started to become more complex because humans need to communicate with a language that is just not a string of words, because what the grammar does, the grammar indicates who is doing what to whom, with how and when and where and why, and we need, in order to communicate those things, we need to add prepositions and past tense verb forms and plural markers and comparative markers and so on. All those inflectional markers that are part of the grammar. And this, when the Pidgin English speakers had children, and the children heard only the Pidgin English, a miracle happened. They started to elaborate the language. The Pidgin started to become more elaborated in grammar. And that is what is then called a creole. This is called the creolization process. This is the creolist view of what may have happened. Well, of course it happened, but the Afrocentric view has its proponents, and it makes sense. The Eurocentric dialectologist view makes sense as well, but so does the creolist view. So I think all of these kind of contribute to this explanation of how African American vernacular became the way it is. It's clearly a distinct dialect from other varieties of English. No, I want to correct myself. I actually want to emphasize this. It is not all that different from the Southern dialects. It shares a lot of features, and it shares a lot of features with a lot of other non-standard dialects. So it is not a typical feature of only African American English, for instance, to use multiple negation I never have no money, or the use of ain't. I'm just picking up two obvious examples because those are features of many, if not all, non-standard varieties of English. So Haitian Creole is based on French, Jamaican Creole is based on English, Gala is an English-based Creole that is spoken on the Sea Islands of the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and that is the most archaic form of African American English, I would probably say so, because it was spoken on an island, so it was isolated from other varieties, a very distinct variety. So this was a quick, so we've done some review. We're also looking forward because in the next chapter, chapter 5, you will be reading about Pidgins and creoles, and so this is a little bit of background. This, going back to review, standard versus non-standard dialects, there is a myth of one correct English. There is no one correct English. Nobody even speaks really written standard English. If you do, you speak like a book, and it's tough to get along and have people like you if you do that. So even the people who call themselves speakers of standard English, it is a modification of what we read in academic elaborated texts. No dialect is linguistically any better than any other dialect. What makes standard English quote unquote standard? It's the social attitudes and power, right? So if a group of speakers have power, their dialect tends to be looked upon as a powerful dialect, as a dialect that is appreciated, that has that overt prestige that we talked about last time. So this is all based on social attitudes. What happened to English as a language, if we take a little bit of a different example and go back to England after the Norman conquest, the French people came to England and with William the Conqueror, and French became, for about 300 years, French became the official language of England, which was used by everyone who quote unquote mattered, right? You know, the upper classes, people in administrative positions, people in the academia, in higher positions, they were speaking French to each other. Kings spoke French, and this lasted for centuries, and then little by little, based on different kinds of things that happened in the surrounding society, different factors contributed to this. One of the factors was the plague, was the Black Death. The bubonic plague that killed 1/3 of Europeans, the European population. So 1, 2, the third was dead. 4, 5, the sixth was dead. And it was horrible. That was at the end of the 14th century. It was spread by rats who carried fleas, and actually it was the fleas who spread the plague. So our plague is not the first one in the history of humankind, and we have a better way of dealing with it, because in the 14th century Europe, there was no hot water that you could wash your hands for 20 minutes, and no face masks, even though you may have seen pictures of the beak kinds of really scary looking things that plague doctors used in order to protect themselves. Yes?
Didn't they throw their waste out in the street?
Say again?
Didn't they throw their waste out in the street?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Absolutely. And that's full of yes. So it was a very filthy, extremely filthy from our point of view. and that's how people then went to. They congregated around village or city regional wells, for instance, to get their drinking water and spread the germs as they were doing that, coming together. It was, you know, crowded and filthy, and no amenities that we today have. So and also the mortality rate was really, really high. I don't want to compare it to COVID, but I would just say that it was worse in many different ways. And yet, humankind survived that. But what that plague did in England linguistically was that the language pattern changed. Of course, all the time, the majority of the English people had been speaking English. That was the language of the masses, the lower classes, the masses. And then the upper class spoke French in England. But now every third person dies, both from the minority French speakers and the majority English speakers. We end up in a situation where the importance of the English speakers kind of rose, because you still need people, you need workers to continue the functions of the society. And the French speakers were not good at doing practical things because they were upper class speakers. So you need to have people build things and feed you, and you know, grow the crops and sow and till the land. And these were the peasants. And together with the importance of the masses, the English speakers, the lower classes, these now as people became more important. Interestingly, the language also became more important. And then we come to the end of the 14th century. We have Geoffrey Chaucer, who is writing in not French, which was the expected, the unmarked variety that he was expected to write in. He started writing in English. It was a groundbreaking turn. He was not the only one, but he was probably the best known. We still know him best from that period. And we still read Canterbury Tales. Here, probably part of your curriculum as well. So that was written in English, not in French. And that's because the attitudes toward English language changed, because the attitudes toward English speakers had changed. So interesting things that may happen. So non-standard dialects are as complex as standard dialects. I think I gave a couple of examples from African American vernacular, which can make distinctions just by, you know, leaving out the verb be or including it in the sentence. I think the example we used here was coffee cold versus coffee be cold, where one coffee be cold means that it's always cold here, but coffee cold, it's cold this moment. So in standard English, you can't make that distinction, because we would have to have the coffee is cold. Then we have to add right now, or this coffee is cold. Or we have to add, so we have to add adverbs usually in order to convey that distinction that African American vernacular can make just by grammar. So coffee be cold, coffee is always cold here. So you would, in standard varieties of English, you have to add words in order to make that distinction. So in that sense, just a quick example, and that's not the only one, but African American is richer, more complex as standard dialects. So we've mentioned that there's a time and place for both standard and non-standard dialects. Our dialects are important for our identity, and many people become bidialectal to allow for social mobility, either upward mobility or lateral mobility, so you can fit in both in Texas and in Boston, or sometimes even what I don't want to call downward mobility, but mobility in all different ways. Like if you want to fit in, like for instance in a lower socioeconomic class group, you'd better adopt some features of that particular dialect. So, complex things connected to a lot of non-linguistic, extra-linguistic issues. So English dialect continuum, if we talk about English only here. So dialects of English, they form this continuum. It's not that I am now speaking Texas English, and now I'm speaking Standard English, and now I'm speaking California English, and now I'm speaking Hispanic English, and now I'm speaking African American English, now I'm speaking Upper Midwest English, and now I'm speaking middle class English, and whatever these things mean. It's not that we can kind of like jump into a totally different dialect, but it's a continuum, and very often that continuum is best described as most vernacular and most standard, and then everything in between. But we pick and choose. We make like a little, like in a smorgasbord. We pick up things and put on our plate different kinds of things, and these are markers of different dialects. And then we have this plate full of things, and that's what we use. Okay. So speakers select features from both vernacular and standard dialects to accommodate changing speech situations. In chapter 4, you have a long discussion about linguistic accommodation, how we always change the way we speak. Most of the time, some people don't, but most of the time, we change the way we speak to accommodate the interlocutor's dialect, way of speaking. You've probably noticed that if you speak with someone who speaks really, really fast, you kind of start to pick up the pace of your own language to match it a little bit better. If someone speaks extremely slowly, to diminish the difference between the pace of your speech, you may slow down your own delivery of your language in order to get closer. So we do this type of linguistic accommodation. Of course, we don't have to do it. And the message we send when we don't want to get closer, dialect-wise, register-wise, to our interlocutors, we are leaving a gap here between us and each other, right? And that we do by linguistic means as well. So, if I go home and continue to speak with my lecture voice there, I am kind of like making a gap between me and my husband, and like I'm still lecturing here. I am in charge. I am knowledgeable. You should appreciate me for all those things, so that he sometimes has to remind me, turn off your lecture voice, and then I do, and then I speak more, add more vernacular features, more maybe relaxed, not as loud. So anyway, so we select these features to accommodate changing speech situations. Speech situations always change. All speakers shift within a range along this continuum according to the situation. Also important to remember that non-standard and standard dialects, they may be used as register markers by multi-dialectal speakers. Anyone who has gone to school, gone to university, gotten a degree, they have most likely become quite knowledgeable, adapted, picked up, learned, acquired the standard dialect, because everything you do at universities, everything you read, everything that is presented, most things that are presented to you are done in standard English. So you have become very, very familiar with that. And you have, no matter what your native dialect is, you will become quite fluent in the standard dialect. And then you can congratulate yourself for being bidialectal, multidialectal, and you can use this as a resource to deal with different speech situations that you end up in. So in different registers, you can use the register of the standard dialect. In certain in certain situations, you use standard dialect as a register marker, as a situational marker. In certain other situations, you would be using more features from a non-standard variety. So African American English, just to kind of like cap up this thing, African American English is not a deviation, and I emphasize this because it's a common misconception. It's not a deviation from standard English. It's a complete, elaborate system with its own grammatical rules, just as any other dialect. Working class dialect, Texas dialect, where we proudly say y'all, and so on. So register style variation is variation according to the situations of language use, and these variations in the speech situations. They include the topics, the setting where we speak, who the people are who are speaking, the participants, what the goals of the speech situation are, and so on. So some topics, they require formal, informal registers, some more formal registers, some spoken registers, and some written registers, and so on and so forth. So if you are asked to write an academic paper, you wouldn't write it in a spoken register or very informal register. You would write it in written registers, academic registers. Now this does not show, can you see that at all? Small text, kind of, sort of. I'm posting this on Blackboard anyway, so you can see it there. And okay, there we go. There, a little bit better, but I'll post this anyway. This is a very classic chart, which I have used because I think it's an excellent chart. It's based on Brown and Fraser going back to 1979. They were writing about speech as a marker of situation. So this is kind of like at the time when they introduced the notion of register, and how register variation is tied with the situation of speech. So here we have the situation, Then this kind of teases apart the different features of the speech situation, even though we've mentioned topic and participants and setting and goals, but this kind of elaborates on that. So the situation can be divided into the scene and into the participants. So what's the scene of communication and who the participants are. And let's look at, during the remaining 3 minutes, look at the scene first. It can be divided into the setting, what the setting is more concretely than just the scene, and what the purpose of the communication is. Like our purpose, our setting here is that I am here behind the monitor and behind the podium and behind the camera, and you are sitting on the auditorium seat. So that's our setting. Now, what is are there bystanders? We don't have any bystanders. We could have my husband walking along the corridor there and waving at me, and that would become sort of a bystander. So I would kind of like stop and hi, but he's not there today. Bystanders make a difference. If we have a situation where the department chair kind of like comes in quietly and sits himself down at the back row and says, oh, I'm just going to be sitting here for the rest of your class to be able to evaluate how you are teaching this class, or whatever for faculty evaluation system purposes, whether I deserve a higher evaluation or something not high. And so if he's here, I know, okay, I better kind of like shape up, and I would change the way I speak a little bit, not to become a different person, but just to take into consideration that I am being watched. We all know how that happens if there's a bystander who is kind of like making, just not maliciously, but just being there. If somebody is there, if one of you were to bring a friend here to class, which sometimes happens, in some way that might change this situation. We might make some comments to, have you ever heard about this term or whatever. So it would change the situation. The locale it makes a difference. The time makes a difference. And I will be posting this. I'll probably bring this up also next time, because I do want to speak about all these separate things. Because they are important to kind of consciously be aware of, especially when you start thinking about your projects. So it gives kind of like feed for thought that what all may change. But I'll post it there. And I think this is time to end our lecture, and I wish you a very good rest of the day.